We are ready to begin the actual economic outlook. We have three terrific panelists with us this afternoon: Randy Kroszner, Austin Goolsbee, and Carl Tannenbaum. Randy Kroszner is the Norm R. Bobbins Professor of Economics at Booth. He served as a governor of the Federal Reserve System from March 2006 until January 2009, where he chaired the Committee on Supervision and Regulation of Banking Institutions and the Committee on Consumer and Community Affairs. He took a leading role in developing responses to the financial crisis and new initiatives to improve consumer protection and disclosure, including rules related to home mortgages and credit cards. In addition, Randy served in the White House as a member of the President's Council on Economic Advisors, from 2001 to 2003. Thank you, Randy, for returning again for this year's Economic Outlook. Our next panelist is Austin Goolsbee, the Robert P. Gwynn Professor of Economics at Chicago Booth. Austin served in Washington as the chairman of the Council of Economic Advisors and a member of the President's Cabinet. Before Washington, his research earned him recognition as a Fulbright Scholar and a Sloan Fellow. In previous years, he was named one of the 100 Global Leaders of Tomorrow by the World Economic Forum and one of the 6 Gurus of the Future by the Financial Times. And in 2009 was voted, and this might be his most important accomplishment, DC's funniest celebrity. We are pleased to have Austin with us again this year. Our final speaker is Carl Tannenbaum, Senior Vice President and Chief Economist at Northern Trust. As Chief Economist, Carl briefs clients on the economy and business conditions, prepares the bank's official economic outlook, and participates in forecast surveys. He's a member of the bank's Investment Policy Committee and its Asset Liability Management Committee. He spent 4 years at the Federal Reserve, where he led the risk section. He was deeply involved in the central bank's response to the 2008 financial crisis, helped to create and conduct its stress testing program, and advised senior Federal Reserve leaders on developments in banking and the financial markets. We are very pleased to have Carl with us today. With that, let me turn it over to Randy to kick things off.
I'm absolutely delighted to be back, and particularly delighted to be back now when it's about 35 degrees warmer than it was last year. And it turns out that 35 degrees made an awfully big difference to the economy. We thought that, well, we're tough people in Chicago. Sure, it's a little bit cold, polar vortex and all that, but we can take it. The rest of the country couldn't. And we had a very, very sharp contraction in the first quarter of last year. Now, of course, that affected my forecast a little bit. And so for accountability purposes, I always try to go back for accountability. And as I usually mention, accountability is always a little less painful when you are lucky enough to get most of it right. So if I look back to my forecast from last year, I had said that I was going to upgrade from the sideways slide that I've been talking about for a number of years to a more rapid recovery, with GDP growth finally getting into the 3s, with continued gradual decline in the unemployment rate, and still little inflation pressure. Well, 2 out of 3 ain't bad. So I did okay on that score. We didn't quite get into the 3s, and I think that was largely due to the frigid first quarter of last year. But then spring sprung, and we've had reasonably good growth through the rest of the year. Looking forward to the next year, I'm going to suggest that we are on a trajectory to be able to grow into 3s again. Continue to have a gradual decline in the unemployment rate. We moved from 7% down to 5.6%. Now people can hear me more. Should I start again? I'm delighted to be here. So it was cold outside last year, and it's not so cold now. And that was the main theme of what I'd had. And of course, if you didn't hear me from before, I got everything right in the forecast from last year. So everything was just absolutely perfect. So I'm glad the microphone was a little bit off. I have a payment coming to the mic guys coming up soon. And so I think we're on a trajectory to be able to grow in the 3s this year. We've had pretty strong growth for the last 3 quarters. But there's still a lot of fragilities out there, and I think that's going to be kind of the theme for this year, sort of the fragilities that might take us away from that kind of growth. Well, let's look at the labor market, for example. Well, we've got the unemployment rate down to 5.6%. We should think of that as a pretty good level, not too far from where there's a broad balance in the labor market, and that you might start to see some wage pressure, perhaps, at least in some models. Well, we're not seeing any. And you can see in the most recent monthly report, wages actually declined a bit. Inflation has been running about 1.5%, but real wages have barely been keeping up, and the last few months have actually been slipping back. So how can this be? We're generating 250,000 jobs per month, but we're not getting any wage pressure. And I think that's because we should be focusing on broader measures of the labor market. This is something that I think the Fed focuses on quite a bit, because they actually have dropped the reference simply to the unemployment rate in their statement over the last year, and they're focusing on broader measures of labor market utilization and underutilization. In particular, there's this broader measure, the so-called U6, that takes into account not just the traditional definition of those who are unemployed. In the US, the definition we use is that to be considered part of the labor force, you have to either be working or you have to be actively looking for work. That is, that you've actively looked for a job in the last month and say you want to be employed. Well, that's fine and dandy, but as undoubtedly you've heard, there's been a lot of decline in labor force participation. So there are a lot of people who looked sometime in the last year or so, but have kind of given up recently. That's about 1.5 million people. And so, you might want to take those people into account, because potentially there are people who will be entering the labor force and potentially competing with, in the labor market. We also have an astonishing number of people who are employed part-time who would prefer to be full-time. And that's actually accounted for part of the decline in the unemployment rate. Part of it is lower labor force participation, so there are sort of fewer people being counted as looking for work, so you don't have to generate as many jobs to have the unemployment rate go down. But also we've been generating a lot of part-time employment, but these are people who want to have full-time jobs. There are about 7 million people who report that they have part-time employment but would prefer to be employed full-time. Well, when you put those two pieces together, you get this sort of broader U6 measure, and that gives you an unemployment rate that's double the 5.6. It's 11.2. And so I think looking at those broader measures of the labor market are very important for thinking about both. Well, for multiple things, thinking about the state of the labor market, for thinking about pressures, in particular wage pressures, and especially thinking about Federal Reserve policy. And I want to talk a little bit about Federal Reserve policy now, because one of the challenges that the Fed faces is that they want to have liftoff. They really want to try to get out of this extraordinary policy. I mean, I really don't think anyone who is sitting around the Federal Open Market Committee, the FOMC table, with me back in 2008, 2009, thought that 6 years hence we would be debating whether next year we're going to raise rates or whether it's going to be the year after. I really don't think anyone thought that. One of the reasons for that has been the tepid recovery, but also a very important reason is we've had very low inflation. As you know, there were many people, including some of my colleagues, who were very concerned about the potential for inflation. The Fed has gone crazy. Sort of like those sort of old videos of girls gone wild. The Fed's gone wild. They're just going out and buying anything they can grab which I guess is like those videos, which I've only seen trailers for. I haven't seen any of those videos, honestly. And certainly that was not any of the discussion around the FOMC table. You see the full transcripts. We didn't talk about that. What we did talk about was a deep concern about deflation, not inflation. And so the Fed's balance sheet, when I was there, for the last 3 or 4 months that I was there, it went from $800 billion to $2.4 trillion. It came back down. It's now at $4.5 trillion. But what's happened to inflation? Inflation's low, not high. Inflation seems to be trending down. If you look at inflation expectations, especially intermediate to longer expectations, they're actually quite low. They're at lows back to the bad old days when we thought we were facing deflation in late 2008. And this is something that's not unique to the U.S. This is something that's also happening in Europe. And this is one of the concerns that the Fed has, because I think their growth trajectory is not too far from mine, but I think they're going to be, as they say, patient in raising rates. And I think they're going to be exercising a lot of patience, not only because of lack of inflation pressures in the U.S., but because of some of these fragilities that could have an effect on the U.S. internationally, and particularly on the inflation front. What we've seen in in Europe is the ECB, the European Central Bank, taking bold actions early on when the heat of the crisis was highest, and they bought a lot of assets, much like we did in the U.S., and basically brought their balance sheet to as a percentage of Eurozone's GDP, similar to what the U.S. had done, actually a little bit above it, about 30%. But they've allowed it to drop to 20% over the last 18 months. In the U.S., we've kept it at about 25 or 20, moving up to about 25% of GDP. But until recently, it had been growing and continued to grow rapidly. In Europe, allowed it to shrink, and what's happened in Europe? We're getting close to deflation. And actually, the most recent monthly report would suggest that prices have actually fallen over the last year. Now, of course, there are oil price issues, and I know Austin's going to focus more on oil prices, so I'm not going to focus on those as much. But even if you strip out things like oil prices, you're still seeing a decline in the pace of inflation, getting to near zero and perhaps even slipping down to negative territory. And there's been an enormous debate within Europe of what can they do and what should they do. The Germans have always taken a very strong stance against inflation, and this is sort of I hope this isn't too much of a central banker's joke, but the Germans, they count, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, but they count inflation 1, 2, 3, 1 million. Because if they see inflation moving up just slightly, they think it's going to be hyperinflation, and so it's, the world is going to end. And so when inflation in Europe was still above 1%, they were saying 1, 2, 3, a million, and so we can't do anything about that. But there's a real challenge, because if you start to get inflation moving down and inflation expectations moving down, it can be very difficult to pull out of that. That was a lesson certainly that Milton Friedman had taught, Bernanke, myself, Mishkin, others who had been at the Fed, that you don't want deflation to take hold and deflation expectations to take hold. That's why we acted so boldly at the end of 2008 and 2009, and then had subsequent rounds of asset purchases to try to make sure we don't have that outcome. Why is that so bad? Two broad main reasons. One is, just think about it, if you're going to be buying a car and you know there's going to be a sale in that car in 6 months and the price is lower, what are you going to do? You might wait a little while to buy that car. Think about that more broadly. If a lot of different types of goods are going to fall, demand may go down. In addition, think about if you're trying to repay your debts. So let's say you have $100 million worth of debt outstanding. You were going to sell $1.5 million of some particular product at $1 each. Well, what happened? And so you get $150 million, easily repay your debt. Now let's assume that you're not even losing demand, and usually in these times that we're talking about, deflationary times, you are. Let's say you're not losing demand, but the price level comes down. So you're only getting 75 cents for each of those, and so then you can't repay your debt. You don't have enough to repay. That's the so-called debt deflation. And that was really pernicious in the 30s in the U.S., and obviously in Japan had that challenge also. Not in extremis as we did, but that is one of the issues that some of my other colleagues, like Anil Kashyap, has talked about the zombie banks and zombie institutions in Japan, and that was part of the challenge that they were facing. And so I think it's incredibly important for Europe, but also for the world economy, and for, given the consequences potentially for the U.S., if Europe were to fall into deflation. Now, there'll be a meeting very soon where there's going to be a decision of whether they're going to go ahead and start to purchase more assets. I think it's extremely important that they do that, but they have to do that boldly. And what I want to do is, and I'm going to talk about a few anniversaries, and one of the anniversaries here that I think is quite relevant is thinking back to Europe. It's the 200th anniversary of the defeat of Napoleon and the Congress of Vienna, which set 40 years of stability in Europe. So this is what the Euro and the EU was supposed to do. But then they hit a crisis. It was 160 years ago, the Crimean crisis. maybe sometimes history repeats itself, and obviously we're facing some of those same challenges today. One of the most famous things from the Crimean crisis was the charge of the Light Brigade. I don't know if you remember, perhaps from grammar school, hearing about Tennyson's poem about this ill-fated British Light Brigade that was sent against, by mistake, a very, very strong fortified Russian position. Cannons to the left of me, cannons to the right of me, and so rode the 600. And so now the Europeans are faced with this major challenge for thinking about how are they going to face the deflation. Will they be sending the light cavalry, as the Germans and others want them to do, or do they need to really realize this is a very, very potent enemy? The deflation is an extremely potent enemy, and so we should not be just sending the Light Brigade. We should be sending very, very fully loaded troops, taking a very bold step forward. Now, it's not as easy for the European Central Bank to do the kinds of things that we did at the Fed, because in Europe, you don't have one government bond market. In the US, it was pretty easy to do that because you had US Treasuries. In Europe, you don't have that. You have all the different countries. In addition, we had a relatively deep mortgage market, so the asset-backed securities. We could go into one market. There, the markets are more fragmented and not as deep. So just think about the political challenge that we at the Fed would have had if what we had to decide was not, well, how many bonds are we going to buy, but do we buy California state debt? Do we buy Illinois state debt? Do we buy New York state debt? You can just imagine the political challenges that we would have had in that. And I mentioned Illinois because hopefully we're going to get some changes and some improvement in our fiscal stance down in Springfield. But Illinois has an extremely low debt rating. And of course, a number of members of the Eurozone have an extremely low debt rating. And one of the issues there is, with an election coming up in Greece, one of the parties that may possibly get control has said, well, we want a better deal on our debt. We don't want to pay as much as we had promised to pay from before. And so there are even more challenges there. So should the ECB be taking on those kinds of risks? In the U.S., we bought U.S. Treasury securities and the mortgage-backed securities that had the federal backstop behind Freddie Mac and Fannie Mae. So an enormous political challenge, an enormous economic challenge, much greater one for Europe, but I think it's extremely important that they face it and they don't make the mistake of the Light Brigade and send only light troops against that challenge. That's one of the major challenges also for the U.S. is sort of seeing these risks around the world. Actually, quite interestingly, Raghu Rajan, who has spoken on this panel many a time and who is now the Reserve Bank Governor of India, he had established his bona fides as a very strong anti-inflation fighter, raising rates very rapidly, even though growth was just okay in India, but because inflation was starting to move up. But what's happened? Inflation started to move down, and inflation expectations have moved down very significantly. So just yesterday, Raghu did a surprise rate cut, because I think he also sees the challenges not just in the U.S. and in Europe, but also in emerging markets of potentially much lower inflation and things that perhaps not in India getting to deflation, but in countries around that we get much lower inflation outcomes. And so he, being I think well aware of the charge of the Light Brigade, is making sure that he is well ready for that. We have to make sure in the U.S. that we don't make a false move of trying to raise rates before the economy can withstand it. Now, if we don't have any of these negative things that I've talked about, we'll go along fine, grow in the threes, and so I think by the fall, the Fed will be able to be on a trajectory to raise rates, perhaps in the September meeting or in the December meeting. But given these challenges that I've just talked about, I think the Fed, as they've said, is going to be patient. In the most recent statement, they also, very interestingly, included discussion of expectations, and in particular inflation expectations. They hadn't explicitly mentioned that before, and that's something that hasn't gotten much attention in the press, but I think that's one of the most important changes, because as we see inflation expectations starting to move down, as we see interest rates starting to move down, the 10-year rate in the U.S. is now at 1.8. In Germany, it's about 40 basis points. In Japan, it's 25 basis points. This is suggesting that people are seeing very benign inflation outcomes, potentially negative ones, and not a lot of demand coming in. So it's going to be very important for the Fed to be looking at these expectations measures, being very careful about them, and I think being very patient. So I think the theme that I'll end with is that we will see a lot of patience, and I hope we will have patience for and the Fed will have patience in the next year. And also, we must make sure that we don't send in the light cavalry if we see the threat of deflation, but we have to send in the full troops. Thank you very much.
Okay, well, the challenge of speakers' openings has been solved, not just for us, but for each of you, as I'm going to describe in a second. You've seen Sunil begin with the Latin motto of the university, Randy quoting literature. I have found that the Google Translate on your phone can turn anything that you wanted to say into Latin in a way that sounds quite distinguished. So if you have a daughter, son, wedding coming up, graduation party, it sounds good, as I'll tell you. E non sic sentire bonum. I'm feeling sick to my stomach. You know, you can quote anything. I have adopted the theme for this year of Nemo enim scit quid agatur in infernum. No one knows what the hell is going on in Latin. Now, we actually did pretty well from our predictions last year. I was feeling a little nervous. We sat at the table. I talked to Chuck. Chuck said, you know, in 2008, I came to this economic outlook, and I based a number of major business decisions on what I heard there. And they were totally wrong. And I said, well, in fairness to us, we didn't invite back the same speakers from 2008. And you may or may not be familiar, there is a court case of a guy who has sued. He invested and lost all his money, and he sued his old business school professors because he said he was just following what they told him. And their defense was, no, any reasonable person would have forgotten what we said a long time ago. So I was going to talk about three basic issues, maybe four basic issues quickly, and then turn it over, and hopefully you'll have forgotten what I said. The first is just, what is the macroeconomic outlook for the United States? I think there are three categories of people that I talk to, three worldviews. One is the people who say it's going to be great. We finally turned the corner. And you remember last year I told you there's all these, yes, we turned the corner. And they've been saying that every year. These are the optimistic people. You know, you hate these people. Oh, shut up. You know, it's 6 a.m. Stop smiling. They say we've had 2 straight quarters of GDP growth over 4%. This one 5%. Maybe the next one will be 6%. It's going to be like 1984 all over again. We've reached escape velocity, etc. The second group are the hyperinflationists who've just been waiting for the last 6 years. Oh boy, the Fed has screwed it all up and we're about to get 1,000% inflation. And then the third category are the naysayers who think the complete opposite, who think if you look at interest rates, if you look at what's happening in the stock market, we're on the brink of recession. If you go to the National Bureau of Economic Research Business Cycle Dating Commission, that's not a dating site. It's a date. They date the business cycle. The average expansion lasts 4 years and 11 months, which means that if this were average, the recession should have began in the summer of 14. So those people say, oh boy, we're long in the tooth. And you look at the rise of subprime lending, which in autos exceeds what it ever was at the height of the credit boom. You see an expansion back into subprime housing lending, and they say, here we go again. It's 2015 is going to be a horrible year. Okay, I think all three of those categories are totally wrong. And I think that what we should expect to see is more of the same, exactly what we've been seeing, just a little bit faster, which is 2015, in my view, will be a decent year, but not a great year. And the people that think we've finally reached escape velocity will admit by the summer, well, we got ahead of ourselves, but next year is the year, 2016 will be the escape velocity. The people counting on consumer spending to come strongly rebounding back and housing construction to finally kick back up to the normal levels of 2006, as I told you last year, they're going to be disappointed again because 2006 is the thing that was not normal, and we're not going to go back to that. It's going to be much more modest than that. We will get a bump up from the fact that oil prices are low. You've already seen at work the same dynamic that has played out when that has happened in the past, which is consumer confidence rebounds strongly, stronger than its impact on household balance sheets. The gas is important, but it's not that important. But people really rebound in their consumer confidence, and so consumer spending will probably go up. On the other side of the ledger, the U.S. has become a major oil producing nation, so we will get a minus coming from less investment, and capital investment of the energy sector has been almost 1/3 of the equipment investment in the United States. So that's likely to slow substantially. Those two things weighed against each other are a small positive, but not the kind of big, juicy positive that people want if they look back to the older time periods like the 80s or even the 90s. So overall, unemployment, the employment picture is improving. I think you will see modest wage growth finally, but not overwhelming because the growth rate will not be overwhelmingly high. A little bit higher than last year, which was a little bit higher than the year before. Okay, point two, what do we make of the price of oil? Why is this happening? That over a period of 2 months, we can see the price really essentially be cut in half. And maybe the best way to set the stage for this is to think of my parents retired out in Abilene, Texas, on the edge of the Permian Basin in West Texas, and just sitting on the top of the Cline Shale, which evidently is the biggest bigger than the Eagle Ford Shale and the Marcellus Shale combined, or I might be getting my shales mixed up, but it's bigger than two of them. Their only problem is there's no water there, so they have yet to get any of the oil. But in Abilene, they have believed that they will be the world's next Silicon Valley, but of oil, that they're going to be the richest city in America. People are very nervous in Abilene, Texas, and if you go there, they think that this is all a geopolitical plot from the Saudis to shut down fracking in the United States. Now, they're deeply paranoid about that. And there are a lot of people who believe that, in essence, what has happened here is a supply glut created by all of the oil discoveries we had in the United States. And now the oil-producing world like OPEC is trying to rid the world of the scourge of American oil. I think this misunderstands one of the fundamental economic points that economists have, objections that we have to any argument about predatory pricing, which is if you come up with an explanation that they're going to hurt themselves in order to hurt the other guy more, you have to have in your mind some explanation of, and how will they make back the money in the future? So, yes, they could produce so much oil in the Middle East that it would drive the price of oil down and fracking and drilling in North America would cease. But how would they ever make back the money that they lost by doing that? Because the second they did cut their production and the prices went back up, all of the people in Abilene, Texas are going to say, get the stuff out of the garage, we're going back out and we're going to start pumping again. So I don't think it's that. The supply increases from the United States are quite dramatic. They're up to 4 million barrels a day. But there's nothing that was a surprise that didn't massively increase in a 2-month period, it doesn't explain why prices went off a cliff. You have one element that Libya came back online, though then it then goes back offline, so there's more volatility than has been shown in the price. And I think you are forced to contemplate that what is happening is actually the demand for oil is slowing much more rapidly than anyone predicted or than anyone has understood. And most likely that means that the growth rate in China is not as high as even they have been saying. In the official statistics, they have been reducing the growth rate. As many of you know, you can't really tell that much from the official statistics that come out from China. You would be better off oftentimes asking FedEx how many packages got sent from China, asking oil companies how much oil got sent. Guys get satellites, they look at how many people turned on their lights. Electricity usage is estimated to be up only 4% for the year, and Chinese demand for petroleum distillates was up 0% for the year. So we don't know what the right number is, but if it's slowing significantly in China more than we thought, that would explain why, with the levels of supply up here and demand falling off rapidly, you would see the prices go down. Certainly it's not helping things in Europe. Usually I'm the one with the turd in the punch bowl telling you how bad Europe is going to be. But this year Randy has already preempted me. So I'm not going to say anything more about Europe than two things. One, the great Chicago economist Milton Friedman on his deathbed said what? The euro will never survive because it's price fixing. He said they won't be able to do it. And so I continue to believe that they will attempt quantitative easing at the ECB. They will try extending and pretending and putting off debt for Greece. But they will have to decide in Germany, to a lesser extent the other Northern European countries, but Germany especially, either they're going to subsidize forever to hold the thing together, or else every 9 months we will have another financial crisis in another country of Europe again and again and again, for every economic outlook from now until eternity, until finally some of the countries say we cannot take this anymore, we're leaving the Eurozone. Okay. Finally, I would be remiss if I did not say something about Washington, D.C. What will happen in Washington, D.C.? Recall that for 2 years I've been telling you nothing. Nothing would happen, and that's the best thing that you could hope for, would be as if nothing happened. And I was right. Nothing did happen. And boy, did it not happen. Now, this past year, as we came to the election, it was about 3-4 months before the election, I got called by a reporter who asked me, what do you think is the probability that any even medium-sized legislation will pass Congress and be signed by the president before the midterm election? And I said, 0%. And she said, do you think that will change if the Republicans take the Senate? And I said, yes, I believe that will be cut in half. She then quoted me as saying, Goolsbee believes the probability of a deal will be cut in half after an election. The dynamic of what is happening in Washington is not unusual for this time of an administration. You're coming to the end, and that is both parties begin setting up show votes to establish to America for the next election, we're for this and they're for that. And the point of those show votes is not to make a compromise. The point of the show votes is to show where we differ. It means on things like shutting down the government over the budget, I think they will be able to make a deal because that one's already established. Republicans don't win in the public eye from a budget showdown. So therefore, that will not be the area of the show votes. They'll just find some way behind this. Yep, fine, done. They'll get it. They'll get that off the table. Instead, there will be things like what I've been saying for some time and has now transpired, they would pass a Keystone Pipeline bill. But they would not pass, the Republicans, a Keystone Pipeline bill that watered it down in a way to try to entice the president to sign the Keystone bill. They would instead specifically make the Keystone bill and require the president to put his birth certificate on it and defund Planned Parenthood and NPR at the same time, wanting him to veto it. They will want to pass a bill that the president will veto so they can say, we're for this and he is against this. And the Democrats were working the same way. It is why I believe the things are coming to a head over immigration. It's a perfect issue where both sides think they're winning the issue, and they're going to come up with ways to figuratively defund immigration, and the president to say, I will veto any figurative defunding of the thing I'm not yet doing. And they say, we will override the veto of something that we didn't pass that you're not going to do. It means on corporate tax reform, which both sides right now believe is where they are the closest, nothing will happen. And on corporate tax reform, and a bunch of you say, no, wait, but there was a bill that Dave Camp came out with that was actually, Dave Camp was the Republican head of the tax committee in the House. He came out with a corporate tax reform idea. The president and the Treasury released their corporate tax reform idea, and there's actually a great deal of overlap. They're both about broadening the base and lowering the rate to make it internationally competitive. So you might say, well, that's a perfect place for them to make an agreement. Yes, until you look at those two bills, and the thing that they agree on is that there would be a one-time significant increase in corporate taxes, and the Camp bill uses that money to reduce the rate in the future, and the Obama bill would use that money to pay for an infrastructure investment. But they're both an immediate increase in corporate taxes for the next 3 years. I don't think the corporate sector understands that. They're saying we want corporate tax reform, and as soon as they see the proposals, they're going to say, let's not have bipartisan agreement, shall we? So I don't think corporate tax reform will move. I think they will have show votes on immigration. And the one issue where I think there could actually be some movement is on trade. So you saw the president go to China and sign, under what executive authorities he has, some deals on information technology trade, and China and the U.S. agreed on some climate change goals. Trade is an issue in which predominantly the Republican Party agrees with the president, and the issue of trade severely divides the Democratic Party. It's exactly the kind of thing that the Republicans would love to enable, which is something in which the left wing of the Democrats will fight with the centrist wing of the Democrats. So I actually think that if there is going to be one thing that they agree on, it might be Republicans voting for trade promotion authority to give to the president, to tempt him to want to try to do trade deals so that his own party will attack him and they can have an argument amongst themselves rather than the Republicans amongst themselves. Overall, the deficit continues to fall, and most of the actions at this point in an administration will be unilateral actions using regulatory authorities or in foreign policy. That means that for 2016, 2017, there will be an increase in political uncertainty, the way there always is, because the first thing that a new administration does when they come in, if it's of the other party, is they say, go find all the executive orders that the last people did in the last 2 years, and let's repeal them on day one, because there are not many things you can do on day one, but that is one of them. So everything that happens from here on out, there's a very decent chance that if Republicans take over, they reverse it. And that's the time? Okay. So I will just leave you with the thought I get. President Obama was in town. He gave a speech up at Northwestern. And I went up and I saw him. I hadn't seen him for a while. And I said, first of all, you know, the economy would probably be doing a lot better if you weren't spending all your time with these Kellogg people. And he laughed. And he was actually in good spirits. A lot of the people around him were kind of down. And I said, look, guys, I know you're down. You feel like there's gridlock, nothing's happening. You know, it feels like he's a lame duck. There's only 2 years left. I said, but think of it differently. The last 2 years of Bush, we had Hurricane Katrina and a financial crisis. The last 2 years of Clinton, he was impeached. The previous Bush voted out of office. Iran-Contra, Carter defeated, Watergate, Vietnam, assassination. Dwight Eisenhower had a heart attack and spent 9 months bedridden. Maybe it's going great. I said, maybe it's going well. And as I look out over at the economy again, I think maybe this is as good as it's going to get. Yeah.
Well, Austin, I have to tell you, I spent the last couple of days in Washington, and there are still people there who are ill after having witnessed John Boehner attempting to kiss Nancy Pelosi. It's just a very unnatural association. Good afternoon. Did everybody have a nice holiday? Yes. I didn't. I don't know why. But every year, somebody at my holiday table brings up a third rail issue. While other families are celebrating life, love, and friendship, our crowd is tackling such divisive topics as bank bailouts, quantitative easing, and fiscal restructuring. Nothing, after all, goes better with a nice Pinot Noir than a heaping platter of controversy at my house. For us, there's nothing that brings the generations together like a good debate over pension restructuring. No cost of living adjustment for you, Grandma. Now pass the potatoes. This year's kerfuffle centered on interest rates. Because I happened to work for the Federal Reserve during the period that rates were brought to zero, I was blamed for everything from low yields on CDs to the bubbles that will inevitably form on the back of the cheap credit that we've had since then. When they burst, they'll necessitate another round of bank bailouts, quantitative easing, and fiscal restructuring, all of which I will be held responsible for. And as the abuse accumulated, I could take no more of it, and I retreated to the comfort of my garage, where I have a refrigerator filled with beer. And there I passed a relatively carefree Christmas evening. After my guests had left, I felt a little bit badly about leaving, not because it was rude, for assuredly had I stayed, I would have been ruder. But in retrospect, I should have defended myself and American economic policy more aggressively. However controversial, the policy choices made here over the past 6 years have positioned the United States to earn significant dividends, and for that, some credit should certainly accrue. But the performance within our country and across countries remains very uneven. The evolving energy price realignment will close some gaps, but could open others. And the longer that these disparities exist, the politics surrounding them will continue to become more complicated. That is the backdrop that we face as we contemplate 2015. For me, the year's economic picture centers on locomotives, freight, and engineers. Leading the train are a handful of economies who have balanced active economic policy with, at times, leaving well enough alone. As Randy and Austin have capably described, the United States leads that list. We've closed our strongest year of job creation in 15 years, 2 consecutive quarters of growth over 4%, and markets which have been very, very strong. As we think of the factors contributing to all of this, we still have many of them in place. The momentum we've established, along with the continuity of very accommodative monetary policy, provides a long list of tailwinds to push us forward. In fact, when we crunched our numbers on 2015, we found it difficult to keep the rate of real growth here in the United States to 3%. In previous editions of the Economic Outlook, we had wondered whether we'd reach escape velocity. We asked whether 2% was as good as it gets. At least for now, those questions have been answered. The United Kingdom would also be towards the front, closing 2014 with growth of over 2.5% and unemployment that's down to 6%, despite a year in which they encountered Scotland's referendum on independence and anxiety over the value of membership in the economic union. Britain turned in its best year since the 2008 financial crisis. China, for all of its challenges, also is towards the front, although its economy may be losing some steam. I would expect that the growth target to be announced for this year is scarcely going to be 7%, down from 12% only a few years ago. Longer term, China continues to pursue a program of less carbon, less credit, and less corruption. But these worthy aims may be relaxed, at least in the short term, to prevent commerce from slipping further. Few, I think, outside of the Central Committee would deny that there's a housing bubble in China or that some financial institutions are stressed. But the assets of significant foreign currency reserves and political control should buy the time needed to work through these challenges in an orderly way. The Eurozone, as has been mentioned, is presenting everybody else with a heavy load at the moment. None of the policy steps that we recommended last year, namely more aggressive monetary policy, reform structurally of labor markets, and recapitalization of the banking system, has made much progress there. In addition, while Mario Draghi has used clever twists of phrase to keep the probability of a sovereign debt default at a minimum, that is not the same as restoring positive economic momentum. And as Randy mentioned, the European Central Bank's balance sheet has been shrinking, which is not the direction that you would like to see it go in the current circumstance. The lingering malaise in the Eurozone has fueled the rise of populist parties, which are anti-market, anti-EU, and anti-immigrant. The seats won in the European Parliament last spring by some of these parties could be a harbinger of gains in upcoming national elections, which would greatly complicate the challenge of restoring respectable economic activity to the continent. That window is closing, and so I very much hope that next week, when the ECB meets, they will take the action that Randy, among others, has recommended. After a promising start to Abenomics, Japan's reform program also seems stalled, and they are unlikely to be a major contributor to economic growth in 2015 globally. So the speculation as we enter this year centers on whether the power from the leaders will be enough to pull the cabooses along for the ride, or whether those at the back will pull the engines back towards the pack. The energy price crash that Austin discussed does have the potential to be a game changer. My wife, at the very last minute, had an addition to her Christmas list, which was an oil tank to go into our backyard. She called it the gift that would keep on giving. Never mind that the environmental folks or my neighbors might object. She was convinced that stockpiling would be the right thing to do. I tried to take her through the answers to the questions that I've been confronted with on energy, and let me give them to you briefly. As Austin described, both supply and demand factors are at play, but I'd have to tell you that if you look at the amounts involved, they don't seem enough to have caused a nearly $70 correction in the price of oil. There is a lot of speculation about China and the motivations of the Saudis, but I would suggest that perhaps what's going on is within OPEC itself, where while unified in the cause of energy, a lot of those countries do not see eye to eye on other fronts, and the Saudis may in fact be trying to exert some wrath on places like Iran and Syria for other misdeeds. Russia clearly is a loser in all of this, as their economy is in free fall, as is their currency. It is uncertain from this perspective whether Mr. Putin, now backed into a corner, will capitulate or come out swinging. I would certainly bet on the latter, given that any capitulation would be political suicide for him. We cannot rule out that an invasion of Belarus, Georgia, or some other former Soviet satellite might be an action taken in order to accumulate bargaining leverage. It certainly seems fair to say that there's some mystery around the origins and extent of the energy price decline, and in fact, futures markets continue to expect a return to $70 per barrel. All of that is to say, though, that without an understanding of the root causes, making conjecture about where oil prices are headed is especially hazardous. Will there be benefits? There certainly will. The IMF recently came out with a report estimating that falling energy prices will add 0.7% to the annual rate of economic growth in 2015, which is a substantial amount when you view that over the entire globe. Here in the United States, it's estimated that the average household will save $750 per year, and over time, despite the disappointing retail sales number that we got this week, that should be very beneficial to our consumption. And internationally, countries that are heavy importers like Japan, India, and the Eurozone should also benefit. However, other countries, not to mention Russia, are going to be disadvantaged. There are some producers for whom the break-even price is expressed not just in the cost of extraction, but in the amounts needed to fulfill budgetary obligations and provide benefits to citizens. Should oil remain at 40, one can expect not just budgetary and fiscal, but also social trauma in places like Venezuela and others. In addition, please keep an eye on some of these countries whose private sector borrowers have financed themselves in dollars. So just as commodity earnings are falling, debt service is rising because of the exchange rate. And that could create the set of hotspots that could grow over the course of the year. I would agree with Austin that the flexibility of American supply is unlikely to see the fracking sector decline altogether. And as you study individual locations and producers, you'll find that their extraction costs are relatively low, especially when measured on a marginal basis. Finally, how will all of this affect central banking? Central banks in most parts of the world have an inflation target. In the United States, that's expressed as core inflation rather than overall. The concern centers on how to make decisions when the inflation picture is so uncertain. But I would certainly encourage monetary leadership to focus on core elements and not those that are more transitory, and on the longer-term outlook as opposed to the near-term depiction. Central banks will have difficult decisions to make as the months unfold, and seeing clearly as to how they can balance their inflation objective with the more imperative needs of stimulating the economy will continue to be a theme. If, however, the energy price realignment kindles any kind of financial instability, either directly or psychologically, that would be a different matter. In their guardianship of financial stability, the world's central banks may come to find that the main dividend of the energy price fall could be the unsettled character of markets that we saw 7 years ago. In any event, I am optimistic about the new year. I think many of these problems are manageable, and I certainly hope that all goes well so that my discussion at next year's holiday table is a bit more pleasant. If it isn't, I do not intend on suffering alone. Instead, I plan to invite two gentlemen to dinner who had a much more direct influence on our country's economic strategy over the last few years. Randy and Austin, I hope you'd hold next December 25th aside. And I will hold the two chairs nearest to my mother open for your occupation. Dinner is at 5, and the roast will begin shortly thereafter. I look forward to your questions.
We are running a little bit behind schedule, but there are a few questions we've already gotten, and one of them is the one that should be on lots of people's minds, which is, why did the Swiss do what they did today? So reasons and ramifications for ditching the peg, and I'll just open it out to the whole panel.
Well, first of all, is this on? First of all, I want to make it very clear that whenever there's a punch bowl, I would never do what Austin suggested I would do in that punch bowl. Maybe in Abilene, Texas, but certainly not here. The Swiss have been under a lot of pressure. People want Swiss assets, people want a safe haven, and Switzerland is a small country. And so the pressures were getting fairly extreme in what the central bank could do, and because actually, as Austin was saying, they were trying to hold a peg, they were trying to fix a price, and that wasn't consistent with market prices. So you can either eventually go bankrupt doing that, and that's what a lot of Asia did in the Asian currency crisis back in the late 1990s, or at some point you give in. and that's what and they decided that the pressures were just too great. Obviously, this will have a big impact on the Swiss banks and Swiss financial markets, but also there are a lot of people who were borrowing let's say in Poland, borrowing to finance their mortgages in Swiss francs, because the interest rate is really low in Swiss francs. Why not? But of course, if the exchange rate moves by 15% in one day, that's a pretty good reason why not.
I think Randy nailed it. That's why it happened.
So let me turn to, I think all three of you pointed out that many of the economies outside the US are sluggish or underperforming, China in particular. Any bright spots?
Jeff Immelt, the head of GE, is a friend of mine, and I saw him and I said, "Oh boy, Europe is really going to be the worst," and something. He said, "Yeah," he thought it was. He said, "I've been at GE since 1982," and he said, "Of all the years that I've been there, I can't remember a single year when somebody said, you know what's going to save our bacon this year? Europe is going to be growing out of control." So, I think the bright spots have been North America, not just the U.S., but Canada and even Mexico, North America coming back. We'll have to see how the oil story plays out. I think that's been a bigger component of growth in Canada and Mexico. And I guess I'm still a closet optimist that maybe Japan will turn around things more than maybe the most pessimistic folks have been, but it's not much is really bright.
I would throw India into the mix. It has the advantage of being an energy importer. As I mentioned, they export services as opposed to goods, which are still in reasonably high demand. It gives me a certain degree of comfort that a Booth professor is running the central bank, so they'll make the right choices on inflation. And while it's early days and the Indian bureaucracy has ground down optimists before, some of the ideas that Mr. Modi has for reform are encouraging.
I would agree on India, and especially given Raghu's move, that he built up his inflation-fighting credibility, and now, rather than just keep capital forever, he's actually using it in a time that probably could be very valuable for India.
Here's a question that sounds more like a classroom question in a course, but this is, after all, a Booth event. We believe the world is essentially a classroom. So the question goes as follows. Why is a decline in oil price a net gain for the economy? Doesn't it simply shift products and goods purchased?
You guys focused on that?
Yes and no. How it would be a net gain if you just add up the national income accounting is you got consumption, government spending, investment, and then you got this net exports. And historically, we've been a big importer of petroleum, especially. And as the price goes down, we're buying less of that. Consumer spending rises. It's like they're getting a tax cut. They're going to spend more, so you're going to see C go up. Though, as I say, you got to temper that a little with what's going to be the negative on the investment side, because a lot of the investment is there. So I think the fact that it's a global economy is what makes this different than just saying, well, instead of spending money on oil, now you're spending it on TVs. Isn't that the same for well, TV is a bad example because the U.S. doesn't make those. But we're spending it on healthcare and educations rather than on oil. Isn't that the same for the GDP? It's not, because not all of the oil was coming from the U.S.
I think it's very important to understand that what may be more towards a net for the world would be a positive or a negative for countries. But I'd throw another thing into the mix. And that is, to the degree that all of what's happening is perhaps unsettling for investor psychology, if that results in an unfortunate setback for markets, then it can be a net negative. And I sense, just reading the newspapers, that while there are certainly benefits, people are going to be paying less for energy and hopefully spending it elsewhere, that what's dominating conversations, what's driving market volatility, that at least the conversations I'm having, is concern that you may see the beginnings of something that will grow to something very large and unmanageable and unpleasant. And that, I think, would be a very negative impact on the world economy.
And there's also the uncertainty, as you mentioned, about the political issues. So there's a lot of uncertainty about what's exactly driving this, and then also, as Austin says, what is this going to mean in the longer run? And obviously, the Middle East is always a powder keg, and adding this into the mix makes it even more difficult to predict where things are going to go.
The next question is, I think, directed primarily to Randy. You referenced the U6 unemployment measure. And so the question is, has this been tracked historically? And therefore, what does 11.2% really mean?
No, that's a good point. So we've been collecting data for about 25 years on this broader measure of unemployment, the so-called U6, which is now at 11.2. Except for the last few years, if you were to look over the first roughly 20 years of history of the statistic, you would see that the spread is typically 4 percentage points. So if the unemployment rate were 5.6 as it is now, this number would be 9.6, but it's 11.2. So we still have a significant gap, about a 1.6% gap from where it typically is, and so that means that there's still a fair amount of, if you use this as the benchmark, a fair amount of slack left in the labor market.
The next question is a process question. Has the abundance of data improved your ability, and I think I'll broaden that to include the entire profession, the profession's ability to track and forecast the economy?
Track,
you can measure
yes.
it better, sir. Can you track?
Yeah. Our ability to track, yes. They always say about we economists that we have these massive arguments and we're almost able to forecast what's already happened and predict the past, but not without some opposition. I don't think, realistically, forecasting as the way the business world kind of describes it, of make a GDP forecast for 2016, 2015, there is very little place for forecasting in the academic economics research. I think because they've decided nobody's able to forecasting is terribly either difficult or it's impossible, or why do people try to do that? So I haven't seen any evidence that our specific numerical forecasts have gotten any better, but it has totally changed the field of economics and our understanding of a bunch of things. And if you look at someone like Matt Jenskow, who won the Clark Medal this year, his research would have been utterly and totally impossible in even 10 years ago because of the data and the computing power that was needed. So he has a paper that downloads every word printed, not in editorials, but in all the news of all the newspapers of the United States, and it analyzes the phrases. Okay, so there are phrases, they're like 2 words. The phrase death tax is used by Republican congressmen and not Democratic congressmen. And there are other phrases that he calls partisan phrases, and he analyzes every newspaper, their language, as if it were a congressman. And if it were a congressman, would it be a liberal congressman or a conservative congressman? And then he's able to answer a bunch of questions about what papers are more conservative and what drives whether papers are conservative or not. I mean, if you talk about big data, I mean, this is terabytes of data. He's analyzing the actual wording of these things. And in all parts of economics, you've seen this really become quite pervasive.
I think it's more been on the micro side of sort of understanding the behavior of individuals rather than being able to gather the data that allows us to predict that the broad aggregates going forward.
This probably will be our last question. I apologize to those I couldn't get to. This is again a big picture question. Why are you, and I'm paraphrasing the question here, why are you so concerned about deflation? And in particular, the alarm bells sounded quite loudly, and I think some elaboration of that is called for.
Sure. I think the examples of Milton Friedman having done analysis of the 1930s of Japan over the last couple of decades, and then we see what's happening in Europe. There's a very strong concern that once you get into one of these cycles, it's difficult to get out. And we see Japan as having difficulty getting out. Austin seems to be a little bit of optimist that maybe Japan will make it. I think Kuroda, who is the central bank governor, is laser focused on this, and that's why he's recently doubled down and buying even more securities. What's actually quite amazing, I was telling you the challenges in Europe for trying to choose which government bonds to buy. In Japan, they buy stocks. So the Japanese central bank can be a stock picker. Think about the political challenges there, just quite astonishing. But when you get into one of these situations, it becomes very difficult to get out because, as I said, you see things on sale in the future, and so people will defer consumption. It becomes more difficult to repay debt, and so more firms go bankrupt, and so you'll have disruptions of the production process. You'll have people experiencing losses. That's only going to reduce demand further, which would drive down prices further, leading to more deflation, more bankruptcies, et cetera, in this kind of spiral. In addition, the kind of tools that are used by policymakers, in particular monetary policy tools, it becomes more and more difficult to respond as the inflation gets deeper and deeper and deeper. So I think the examples of the 30s in the U.S., Japan most recently, are probably the concrete illustrations that I would use for these sort of broader theoretical points on the challenges of deflation. Something we don't want to face. Don't send in the light brigade against something that is so powerful like this.
Any other final thoughts from the panel?
I would just amplify what Randy said about debt. It's the more subtle of the two consequences of deflation, the deferred consumption being the other. While we've done a pretty good job of reducing deficits around the world, there's still a lot of debt, both at the governmental and the household level. And if we have global disinflation, global deflation, it may be very, very difficult to ultimately get on top of that debt.
Okay, on that cheery note, I'd like to thank the panelists and thank you all for coming. I wish you a happy and prosperous 2015. Thank you.